Okay, guys, so today we are going to continue talking about the topic of classification. And as you remember last week, we were talking about the 8 different levels of classification, starting at the top in domain and going all the way down to the most specific classification, which is species. So for today, we're going to review the topic of domain and what 3 categories fall under domain. And then we are going to talk about the 6 different kingdoms of life. But before we get into that, I want to do a little explaining about eukaryotes and prokaryotes. So all living things on Earth either have eukaryotic cells or prokaryotic cells. And the reason they are one or the other depends on what is on the inside. And the way I remember this difference is by pro equals no. No nucleus and no membrane-bound organelles. So as you can see in our prokaryote on the right, instead of having a nucleus, it has what's called a nucleoid. So we have all the DNA, the genetic material, just kind of floating around in the cytoplasm. Also, you can see that there are some organelles, like ribosomes here, but we don't have those organelles that are surrounded by a membrane like we do in a eukaryotic cell, like the endoplasmic reticulum or the mitochondria. So again, no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles. Here are our 3 domains on Earth. And again, every living thing fits into one of these 3 domains. The first is bacteria. So these are all single-celled organisms. They are prokaryotes. So no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles. They can be found in soil, in water, in our bodies, in our digestive system. They're actually very helpful there. So there are good types of bacteria and bad types of bacteria, like the ones that make us sick, but they can be found in a variety of different environments. Moving on, we have archaea. So archaea are also single-celled organisms, and they're also prokaryotes. So again, no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles. The DNA and the cell walls, however, in archaea are a little different from bacteria. And those differences allow them to live in very extreme environments. For example, deep in the ocean where there's no light or no oxygen, or it's very hot, like in thermal vents, archaea are able to survive in those very, very harsh environments. And finally, we have our third domain. This is our domain, eukarya. So all plants, animals, fungi, protists on Earth are part of eukarya. They're usually multicellular, although they can be unicellular. And we are eukaryotes. So we do have a nucleus and we do have organelles. And our cells are a little bit more complex than archaea and bacteria. Once we go below domain, the next level is kingdom. And on Earth, there are 6 kingdoms: animals, plants, fungi, protists, eubacteria, and archaeobacteria. So let's take a look at that in a little bit more detail. The first kingdom we have here is eubacteria. So this is the kingdom below the domain bacteria. They are unicellular organisms. They don't have a nucleus. Most of them reproduce asexually. So remember, that means that from one parent that usually divides and splits into 2, you get an offspring. So they don't have 2 parents, they just have 1. Bacteria are also consumers, and many of them are able to move. So one example of a bacteria is E. coli. This bacteria can make us sick, and it's usually consumed through food, so not as friendly of a bacteria. The next kingdom is Archaebacteria, and this is the kingdom that is below the domain Archaea. Again, they are unicellular, they don't have a nucleus, they also reproduce asexually, one parent, one child, but these guys can survive, as we mentioned before, in very harsh environments. And an example of a category of archaea are called methanogens. So these are single-celled organisms that make methane gas. Now we are going to explore the 4 kingdoms that fall under the domain Eukarya. So remember, all plants, animals, fungi on Earth are part of Eukarya. But now we need to break those into more specific categories because humans are very different from palm trees, which are very different from mushrooms. So what do those categories look like? The first kingdom is Protista. These are where we find our protists. So these are usually unicellular, and you can see in the picture here, this is an example of an amoeba. It can move, it can consume food, but other protists can even make their own food like plants. So there are some protists that kind of behave like plants, some that kind of behave like animals, others that kind of behave like fungi. There are some different categories in protists. Some of them reproduce sexually, so 2 parents produces 1 child, and some reproduce asexually. Next kingdom, plants, or plantae, our kingdom plantae. These organisms are multicellular, and their cells have cell walls to help with structure and support, and they also have chloroplasts. And what are those for? Making food through photosynthesis. So plants are producers. They take in sunlight and they take in carbon dioxide and water and nutrients to produce their own food and also oxygen for us. Some plants, believe it or not, reproduce sexually and some are asexually. We'll talk about that later in the year. And plants cannot move. They cannot move. Next, we have kingdom fungi. Fungi. So an example of a fungus is a mushroom. Another example is mold. So if you leave food in the refrigerator or out in the cabinet for too long and it's nice and dark and damp, then sometimes you get mold growing. That is a fungus. So molds are unicellular or multicellular, and they are decomposers. So their job in the environment is to break down dead things into nutrients so that other animals can use those nutrients again. They're kind of like the recyclers. So these cells in fungi have cell walls, but they do not have chloroplasts. Why? Because they don't do photosynthesis. They get their nutrients by breaking down dead things, so they don't have to make their own food. And some fungi reproduce sexually, others asexually. Last but not least, our kingdom, animals, Animalia. So animals are multicellular organisms, and we do not have cell walls, and we do not have chloroplasts because we are consumers. We need to eat other living things, other plants, other animals to get our energy. Most animals reproduce sexually. Some are asexual, but it's not super common. And animals can move. So an example here is a dolphin, but you could also put any animal in this category: ladybugs, butterflies, birds, humans, cats, dogs, all fall into the kingdom Animalia. So going back to our first chart, these are the 6 kingdoms of life. And on Friday, we're going to continue observing and learning a little bit more about the categories and the characteristics of each of these different kingdoms.